Hi, this is Jim Musser with Upstream Ministry, and it's Assumption Week. And last week was Assumption Week. We're talking about assumptions that both parents and church leaders make about raising kids spiritually. And so today, I want to talk particularly to youth pastors about some of the assumptions I've seen them make. And I want to start out with a story from early in my ministry. I was at a meeting and a young man uh, came in with a slightly older man, and it turned out it was his youth pastor. And so I had never seen this young man before, and he introduced himself and introduced his youth pastor and made it seem like that he had been coming to our ministry since the start of the school year, when in fact, this was his first time. And he realized that I knew what he knew, and his eyes practically begged for me not to throw him under the bus and revealed to his youth pastor that he had never been there. And so that youth pastor, whether it was right or wrong of me not to tell the truth, I don't know, but that youth pastor left thinking that this young man had landed solidly on his feet in college and he was going to be okay spiritually, when in fact we never saw that young man again. And that's one of the assumptions that youth pastors can make about their kids, particularly when they graduate from high school. And they can assume that these great young men and women had deep commitments and they would be solid. And I don't know how many times over the years, it didn't happen much later on in my ministry, but early on, where churches would let me know, or pastors would let me know of young people in their church that were coming to my university. And they would extol the attributes of these kids, and they'd be great leaders. And oftentimes we never saw them. And I didn't get the feeling that these kids were involved in a different ministry. I felt like they weren't involved in anything. And but those students would come home on the weekends and come to church, and so it was assumed that they were doing well, when in fact they weren't. That's just an assumption that's easy to make. Another assumption is that if kids are involved in the youth group, that they are somehow committed to Jesus. I've seen that mistake again many times. And one thing that you have to realize is the motivations of young people are many for being someplace. They may be forced to be in your group because mom and dad said so, that they're not going to have certain privileges or whatever unless they go to youth group. It's just that you have to be there. They may be coming because there's some friend that they're really close to that is bringing them. It may be a special relationship. They're interested in somebody romantically, and that's why they're in youth group. Now, they may be there because they love Jesus, but that cannot be assumed until you really get to know that young person and spend time with them and understand what's really going on in their hearts. And you can't do that merely by having a youth group meeting where you just see a group of kids, but you really don't know what's going on with each one of them. And so that makes it difficult. And so it's easy to assume if they're there, then they're committed to Jesus. But we have to really look at that a lot deeper. Another assumption that's made, and I've seen these posts numerous times since social media came into the forefront, where youth pastors will show some picture or video of a concert or some conference, and you see these kids with their arms raised or in prayer and saying, God is definitely at work here right now. And call me a skeptic, but I often wonder if God's really working in the way that these pastors who are making these posts really think. Because I've seen students go to conferences, and I remember students in my ministry going to the Passion Conference and coming back, and they were passionate about the bands. They were passionate about the experience, but 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, I rarely saw a dramatic change in their attitudes or behaviors or the way in which they lived their lives. But it's easy to think that God is at work in tremendous ways. And this is not a diss on conferences or worship nights, but we cannot assume just because a young person is raising their hands that they are worshiping God in a truest form. And so we need to realize that it's easy to make assumptions about what's going on with young people when the facts may be totally different. Again, I've cited this every episode this week. The 50 to 80% of high schoolers that are graduating leave the faith. So if when in high school you perhaps posting, God's really at work here, there's a lot of worship going on, some of that's probably not true, because if it was true, we wouldn't have the huge percentages of kids leaving the faith. And so again, I just want you to think about the assumptions you're making about the kids in your youth groups, because a lot of times they are not accurate, and you need to investigate more. My encouragement would be is get to know as many as you can one-on-one. Ask good questions, penetrating questions, get them talking, observe them, see how they're really acting and living, and have your volunteers do the same thing. Because I think it hampers our ministry to make all these assumptions. And we need to be really clear-eyed and clear-minded in the midst of our ministries. And so I'm going to leave it there. Again, some really, I think, good things to think about. You may not agree with all of them. That's fine. Post a comment. I'd be happy to answer those, respond to those. So until next week, have a great weekend, and we'll see you soon.